Thanks for being on the podcast. A very warm welcome to you, Devin Zuckerman from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And you are part of the Contemplative Science Center. We already had Michael Shee on the last episode of our podcast, and he explained a lot about the Nature Project and how you're working with young students, meditating on different areas of nature. And so I'm so excited and happy as a scholar and as a practitioner myself to have you on the No Drama Dharma podcast for the Center for Contemplative Traditions of the University of Leipzig. So very welcome. And I hope I can learn a lot. And to all the listeners, keep your eyes open. This is very thrilling to me, and I hope to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much, Marco. I'm really happy to be speaking with you today. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, just in the few words we exchanged before the podcast started, you said that the living tradition is it differs very much nowadays from the findings you had in the old Nyingtig, Dzogchen Nyingtig text. And of course, we are aware that there's shifts and changes in living traditions as to what is pronounced in a tradition, and as sometimes you might see its accentuations, but sometimes it's also big shifts in what in a way practices can be perceived, can be done. But what did you find when you looked into the older Nyingtic, in the older layers of Nyingtic texts, and what changed?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So one kind of autobiographically, I think one way to start is with the way that I came about doing this project. I started with reading Longchenpa, who is the kind of premier scholar of the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition. He's a foundational scholar and a landmark scholar of the tradition and widely known. His name is going to be widely known, I think, to many listeners and certainly to many Buddhist practitioners, Tibetan Buddhist practitioners, or even beyond Tibetan Buddhism, right? Beyond Dzogchen, beyond Tibetan Buddhism. So I began with Longchenpa, and I began with a chapter in one of his more famous texts in a collection called the Dzogchen, or the Seven Treasuries. It's a text called the Tekchogdzud, or the Treasury of the Supreme Vehicle, and it's kind of an encyclopedia of Dzogchen ideas. And there's a chapter there about the elements, and I thought that was interesting. And I was reading it with my dissertation advisor, and he quotes from these older tantras in that text. And so I had the thought, I should probably go and see what these texts actually have to say about these topics that Longchenpa is describing. And what I found in the texts, again with the help of my dissertation advisor, David Germano, discussion of the elements. The elements are just present throughout the whole. For example, this kind of root tantra of the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition called the unimpeded sound tantra. The elements are everywhere in a way that is perhaps surprising because, in the work of Longchenpa, they come up certainly, but they're really concentrated to that one chapter in the Tekchogdzud. So I thought that was really interesting. And kind of at the same time, I was coming across passages like famously in Jigme Lingpa, another landmark scholar of the Dzogchen
Hmm.
Nyingtik tradition, really important, formative scholar for the living tradition today. He wrote an important text called the Yeshe Lama. And in the opening passages of the Yeshe Lama, there's he's beginning to describe the path of Dzogchen, or the path of the great perfection, heart essence. He talks about meditating on the elements. And he quotes a passage again from this much older tantra, this unimpeded sound tantra. And he says it's really important to do practice on the elements. But since there's nobody around anymore who's established in this practice, then it's okay if you skip this and move on to the next practices in the kind
Yeah.
of sequence of preliminary practices, main practices, and so on. And I thought that was really interesting too. And so to answer your question, like what's different, there's just this really interesting question about why, during the time of Jigme Lingpa, who lived in the 18th century, like these elements practices, which are clearly so important in the earliest iteration of the tradition in the tantras, right? In the 17 tantras, which we date to, the 10th century, something like that, although they are tantras, so they're kind of They exist outside of time, one could say. Why the elements are so important there. They're so important in the earliest commentaries that we have. And then by the 18th century, there's nobody living who's established in these practices anymore, according to Jigme Lingpa. My work doesn't answer that question, certainly, but it begins from that
Mhm.
curiosity. And so my work is really about what's going on with the elements in this early period. And my dissertation also kind of compared the early period of these elemental discussions and elemental thought with what Longchenpa is talking about in the 14th century. I wonder if it'd be helpful to like describe some examples of
Oh yeah.
what is
I
happening
mean,
with the elements.
I have come across many times
Yeah.
that traditions that haven't been kept alive, or I said, okay,
Mm-hmm.
we cannot continue this because it has not been kept alive, like certain aspects
Mm-hmm.
of magic mass transmission, or
Yeah.
what comes to mind, certain yogic practices or transference of consciousness practices,
Mm-hmm.
where you have a narrative, okay, this has been very important to the tradition, but somehow nobody kept it alive. And we might
Mm-hmm.
ask ourselves the question, why did nobody keep it alive if it was so important? And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you find the argument nobody was capable to do it anymore. This is just what I remember from certain other practices that have been lost.
Uh-huh.
Now, when it comes to the elements, to the element practices, yeah, the question you raised, okay, why wasn't it kept up if it was important and if
Mm-hmm.
it was central? And can you reconstruct it from the text itself? Can you get a clear idea what people were doing?
It's so interesting that you find rationales in other places. Like that's one thing that I have not found is a like rationale for why this practice is no longer popular in the same way.
Hmm.
I'm not going to say that it's not done. There are people who are practicing and utilizing some of these traditions, but it does seem that the kind of widespread popularity of these traditions and a lot of the like oral transmission, like the details of how you do these practices have been lost, it does seem. Tradition and poa, I think, also transference of consciousness. And it's interesting that you find um, some reason in the literature that's given that's like, why people didn't keep up these kinds of practices. I have not seen anything like that around the
Yeah.
elements. And so everything is kind of, we're sort of left to wonder what the reasons could be. And I do have some theories that are, you know, just speculation. It's really hard, especially when you're working with such early materials, to we just know so little about the period of time in which the early commentaries, excuse me, the tantras and the earliest commentaries emerged. So it is hard to do like a real kind of reconstruction of an intellectual history in terms of like what is happening up to, let's say, the 14th century
Hmm.
and beyond, um, in terms of the sort of transmission of the lineage. Um, in terms of the question, like, can we reconstruct the practice? I mean, like I said, there are some people living who have some experience with this practice or have been given like a kind of mengak, a kind of a set of oral instructions connected to doing practices with the elements. This would be like a practice that's sometimes called the guidance to the three awakened bodies, the kusum ginachi, sometimes called um, the yogas of the four sounds, the Jashi Neljor, the yogas of the four elemental sounds, practices that involve listening to the sounds of the elements in order to produce distinctive kinds of realizations. In the texts, they talk a lot about the actualization of the bodies, the awakened bodies of the Buddha, the kusum, the trikaya,
Hmm.
but they also talk a lot about encountering the voices of beings in the six realms. That one of the experiences that really comes through as a result of these practices, as a result of listening through the elements as a kind of media, is this experience of hearing, experiencing. I don't know if we could call it hearing in the strong sense, because it is this
Hmm.
kind of multi-sensory, trans-sensory kind of experience of encountering the suffering and transcendence, expression of suffering and transcendence of beings in the six realms of samsara. I don't, at least the article that I'm writing now, I say, the point is not the point for most of the people who will be reading that article is not to try and reconstruct, it's certainly not my intention or my role in this world to try and reconstruct a kind of elemental contemplative practice based on the materials of the text, but really to see contemplative practice or to see these elemental practices as a kind of provocation for thinking about other ways that we can do contemplation with the natural world, perhaps as a way to inspire or kind of ethically form different kinds of relationships with the
Hmm.
natural world, for example. But I do know of other teachers and lamas who are teaching practices with the elements in entirely different ways based on their own training and experience.
Because when you say um, it is not your role to reconstruct, yes, I wonder if the traditions actually do reconstruct this. I mean, certain practices have been reconstructed, you can say, or
Mm-hmm.
reconstituted by the measure, for example, like treasure findings. You could say, that you have a practice that was extinct or underappreciated at a certain time, and it got reintroduced into the streams of traditions by measure of revealing treasures and by
Mm-hmm.
visionary treasures that revealed the content of a certain practice and also to spread it again amongst people. Nevertheless, what we all try to understand when we deal with contemplative practices also to find the transformative aspect, I think that should happen in the practitioner, what the practitioner herself should achieve by this, what kind of
Mm-hmm.
transformation, what kind of change in the person should actually take place when doing this practice. And then also, I always long to understand where does this fit in the bigger picture of a transmission lineage of uh, a practice system where you can say, okay, except of the most ultimate practices that have no shape anymore, everything slots in at a certain point. Everything builds, I mean, practices build upon
Mm-hmm.
another and try to develop aspects that are based on a certain ground that has been laid before by another practice, and then to take the practitioner further or to develop a certain aspect. So, is, for example, like when you say seeing or hearing the voices or by intention or by almost clairvoyance, it sounds, and the suffering of the six beings. Is this a communicative aspect? Is
Mm-hmm.
this that the practitioner is suddenly able to communicate with these non-human beings, or does this enable to simply perceive more of the world of in the Tibetan world, more of the surrounding that is part of everyone's belief anyhow, but generally not perceived?
Yeah, I know. I think about that too. Like, because, the way they talk about it is in the text is like you hear the sound of water, and then in the sound of water, there you perceive the voices of the Dakini, for example.
Hmm.
So Dakini also are interesting in the way that they exist within the kind of theory of the six realms. Like some of these practices talk very much about like six realms stuff, like hell beings and preta and this sort of thing. And then they talk about the voices of specific gods like Vishnu and Brahma. Like you hear these voices, and then Dakini are kind of interesting because they're these like transcendent beings that are kind of like moving across the scales of the six realms and appearing and transmitting and doing this kind of enlightened activity throughout all of this. So anyway, the point is you hear the voices of the Dakini, and like what does that actually mean? Do you hear their voices as like language? Do you hear their voices as like, they describe their voices as like wrathful, laughing, joyful. Like you almost perceive these like subtle qualities that are embedded in language that aren't actually part of language itself. This interests me very much because I'm also very curious about like what is it actually? Is it a kind of communication? Is it a kind of like didactic, bidirectional conversation that you're having with the
Yeah.
Dakinis? Or is it more of like opening up the sensory apparatus to perceive something beyond what is normally available in kind of ordinary perception. I tend to think it's more of the latter, right? But right now I'm writing
Mm-hmm.
about this. I'm sort of, trying to feel out what I think about all this. And I keep thinking about like, is it like you pick up the water phone and you call the
Yeah.
Dakini, or is it like, are the elements, in other words, a kind of, uh, are the elements themselves expressing, or is it like the elements become a media that connects us
Yeah.
to a wider universe of, yeah, a wider universe, or sort of announce, um, the role and the place of human beings within this, um, yeah, wider cosmology of which human beings are a small but important part. Yeah, these are questions I have.
Yeah, but you don't have like stringent connectors between, like you would say, the Dakini, and suddenly you would speak about, for example, the different kayas, especially the Nirmana kaya and Sambhoga kaya, where um, some of the Dakini, I think, act as a communicator in the text to unveil the Buddhist teaching to people who like opened, you might say, that the sphere, or are open to the sphere of communication on the Sambhogakaya level,
Right.
or
Yeah, I see the question. I understand the question. Like, for example, these texts, we're going to get into maybe kind of a meta place where we're like the theory is turning in on itself, because, of course, these texts are termas. And what I hear in your question is this idea that's common in like the kind of literature surrounding the terma or treasure tradition, which is that like a lot of the termas are transmitted, let's say, through the like facilitation and help of the dakini, or these kind of enlightened beings. And so is there anything in these practices that's about training the awareness to become more perceptible to that kind of transmission? Is
exactly.
that sort of the question? It's a
Yeah,
great question. It's a great question. I mean, I haven't yet encountered in the text like self-awareness in the text that I'm reading, self-awareness about the Terma tradition itself, which is interesting, actually.
yeah.
Like the texts don't know that they're Termas,
Hmm.
which is interesting. I mean, yeah,
Yeah, but are they, I think the level you're speaking now, you must be in the 17 tantras.
in the
What
17
you're,
tantras, yeah,
yeah.
the 17
So
tantras,
I think their own perception, as you said, their self-perception is not yet that of being a treasure
right,
text itself.
right, right.
Um,
There are also commentaries that I read that are closely connected to the
hmm
17 Tantras. These are commentaries that are attributed to Vimalamitra, um,
hmm
who is kind of in many ways, the earlier. It's interesting. It's a little bit difficult to say, but Vimalamitra is associated with the earliest tradition of Terma
Yeah.
in Tibet. And so the commentaries that are attributed to him emerged in the 12th century, and you could say are, yeah, you could say in that sense are thought to be kind of Terma revelations.
Mm.
They don't seem to, as far as I've read, and there's a lot of material to cover yet that I
Yeah,
haven't read yet. It's
it's.
vast.
I think there are some people saying, for example, when you have the treasury of the supreme vehicle, the Tekchokzö by Longchenpa, because he draws so much from these 17 tantras that actually to translate it, you have to also read the 17 tantras, which is a feat that might take up the next decades of your life. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, the literature
yeah,
is vast. The 17 Tantras, there are commentaries to the 17 Tantras that are
mhm,
associated with Vimalamitra that are contained within the Bhima Nyingtig. And
yeah,
then there's other commentaries as well. These are the ones that I read um, that have only really surfaced and become available and present to scholars since since the 20th century. They were in a collection of texts called the Kama Shinto Gepa. That was the version of it that was compiled by Khenpo Munsel.
mm.
So we have this like really late edition of a text that we actually date to a much earlier period around the 12th century.
So to make this clear, you're actually reading material that has been not available to the Tibetan audience or to Tibetan scholars.
Yeah, as far as we know, and there's a lot of, again, like there's just so much literature. There's a lot of work to be done to see if there are any references to these commentaries in the period between like the 12th century and now. And it's very difficult because, of course, there are also commentaries, these short summaries of the 17 tantras that are in contained within the Bhima Nyingtik. So often when you find a reference to the commentaries to the 17 tantras in literature, let's say someone in the 17th century writes in his, collection of transmissions that he's received, he'll say, I also received the commentaries to the 17 tantras. Probably he's referring to the texts that are in the Bhima Nyingtik, not to these texts. So
Yeah.
distinguishing which texts are which is also a
Mhm.
complication. But we're getting into the
Yeah.
philological weeds
No,
now.
but if we go back to, like you said,
Yeah.
Jigme Lingpa said it's important, but since nobody
Hmm.
knows it, it's good to skip. And
Yeah.
I think in my perception, Jigme Lingpa, the revealer of the Longchen Nyingtik system and the writer of the Yeshe Lama commentary and of the Yöntinse, the Treasury of Qualities, he was pivotal, or he was
Mm.
again like Longchen Pa in the 14th century. I think he was again one of those figures who reshaped the landscape in Eastern Tibet and who reshaped practice into largely what we know today. If he brought forth his practice system, omitting or stating to omit, maybe it was omitted already hundreds of years, but he clearly stated it. I think it created again um, a new era of practice where you could say, okay, this is kind of really left aside, and we now focus on these aspects of practice. And I
Hmm.
think with focusing on the essential meditations of Dzogchen, like Gode Rushen, Tekche Togal, preliminaries, and primordial purity and crossing over, like focusing on these very distinct practices, he also cleared the path for practices as they are known today. Maybe going a step further than Longchenpa has gone. When Longchenpa, I think also to the listeners, many of the scholars will know this, but those who haven't engaged so much in the study of Nyingmapa history,
Hmm.
Longchenpa was the figure that who brought everything together that there was as a quite diverse selection of transmissions, of texts, of ideas in the Nyingmapa sphere. And he summarized everything. And in his writings, I think we now have the base for everything that Nyingmapas use. And there's very few transmissions that kind of don't go or that don't accept the way that Longchenpa had put forth the different practices, but also the different philosophical systems at this time. So when we go back to Longchenpa, how much did you find in his writings? Do you know there's much more than in Longchenpa? Did he take the essence? What did he do for
Yeah.
elements?
Yeah. That is a perfect kind of summary. I mean, I like the way you state these sort of there is this kind of archaeological formation to the tradition where like Jigme Lingpa laid the ground for what we know about the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition, let's say today, and how it looks. That landscape was sort of established by Jigme Lingpa. When you excavate beneath that, you find, of course, the ground that Longchenpa laid, right? Which it maybe looks a little bit different. And then if you excavate sort of deeper within that, you find a different kind of terrain, a different kind of universe. I mean, it's a really big question. What did Longchenpa keep and what didn't he keep? One thing that I have become very interested in is the vast literature on, for example, I'm very curious about the elements in particular, but sort of the vast literature on astrology, divination, what could be called like a set of practical arts, like again, divination, astrology, rituals for longevity, and rituals for protection, medicine. All of these things are found in like great abundance. There is a lot of discussion about these kinds of practices in the 17 Tantras materials and in these early commentaries that I described that are attributed to Vimalamitra. Just vast discussion of how to do like calculative arts, these like sea practices or astrology with the elements. A lot of that becomes, or at least this is my sort of read on it, a lot of medicine, astrology, divination becomes professionalized in a different space. So what's preserved in Longchenpa's writing, although there are allusions, of course, to these kinds of practices, the longevity practices, protection, and so on, is a more like kind of pristine contemplative philosophical tradition that, like you said, is synthesized across the various streams of Dzogchen Nyingtig discourse into a coherent, streamlined, kind of encyclopedic textbook type of framework, right, in the work of Longchenpa. What doesn't quite make it into the same extent as in the early tradition is the attention that's given to these almost more like worldly practical concerns, astrologically determined favorable and unfavorable times and conditions for different activities, including contemplative practice, right? There's a vast literature in especially the unimpeded sound tantra on the different kind of elemental body types that people have, and the importance of that, and the importance of understanding your own elemental constitution for
Mm-hmm.
doing kinds of practice, right? Like not all practices. I mean, I think this is a pretty general statement, but I think very true. Not all practices are done in the same way for every person. The distinctiveness of each practitioner's character and kind of biological, physiological
Yeah.
realities are really taken into concern in the early tradition in a way that you don't really see that
I
much. Like
saw
for,
I saw recently in Düjom Lingpa's
Vajraha Tantra
uh,
or Nelograngjo.
there I saw a
mm,
passage there where he explains in not very much detail, but where he lists certain physical conditions related to, you can say, elemental predominance in the body mind setup and preferred styles of practice. Yeah.
yeah,
So
that's a
we're
very
here in the
traditional.
earliest, late 19th, early 20th century. I saw this passage.
Right. So there is this kind of continuation of this idea from the early tradition. That's a very, I would say, traditional Dzogchen idea, in fact.
Hmm.
It's very kind of, yeah, from the very, very kind of earliest Dzogchen Nyingtik scriptural tradition, this idea of having a kind of distinctive elemental body type and the importance of understanding that and knowing oneself, kind of knowing the distinctiveness in one's own, again, like you said, kind of body mind framework for approaching particular kinds of contemplative practices.
I actually interrupted you much earlier in our conversation where you say you wanted to actually list the elements and you just spoke about water because I interrupted you.
Mm.
So maybe
Oh,
you can pick up on that again.
oh yeah, no worries, no worries. Yeah, I think at that moment I had realized I was speaking kind of abstractly about these elemental practices, and I had thought maybe it would be helpful to know that when I talk about elemental contemplative practices, I mean a lot of different things, but one thing that I mean is really practices of going out and listening to, for example, the sound of water. Now we've begun to talk about the elemental body types, right? And so the
Hmm.
elements, maybe to start, consist of earth, water, fire, and wind, sometimes earth, water, fire, wind, and space. There are also other kinds of elaborations of elements like, earth, water, fire, wind, space, consciousness, for
Yeah.
example, that you see in other types of Buddhist literature. In the Dzogchen Nyingtik context, you see both frameworks of both 4 and 5 elements: earth, water, fire, wind, earth, water, fire, wind, space. These practices take account of the idea that everyone has a kind of predominating element in their body. So some people have a what they would call a water body, or an earth body, or a fire body. That information is really important to how you approach contemplative practice, and especially considering these elemental practices are thought to be first ngundro that people do. I think that's where we would place these practices in a traditional kind of path of Dzogchen Nyingtik practice. But not every practice is for every type of person. If you have like a predominating fire type of body, then you do the fire practice first, and then
Mm-hmm.
you can move on to other elements. If you have a water type of body, you do water practice first. This is interesting because it kind of conflicts with what we find in other kinds of Tibetan medical and Ayurvedic theories of how the elements work, namely that like if you have the predominance, if you have like a surplus of one element, then you actually
Mm-hmm.
want to like temper that with a
Ah,
different element.
you
You
mean
want to achieve a balance.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's not what they say to do here, actually. They say if you have a fire body, you should do this fire practice
Yeah.
first. You should
That's
like,
it's very important and very interesting difference that
yeah,
it differs from the medical tradition then.
yeah, it does. I mean, there is a lot of, there are a lot of discussions of the elements that are very similar that are probably inheriting from, something from the Tibetan medical tradition as it was during that time, which also probably was very different in its kind of formal structure than the one that
Mm-hmm.
we might encounter today at like a Kong, for example. So yeah, this idea that the practice for this practice, you want to actually take whatever element is kind of predominant in your system and like match it with its companion in the natural environment if you if you believe in a natural environment is very interesting because it speaks to this kind of theory of relationality that happens between the human being and the world based on the elements. There is a kind of continuation of the inner bodily elements with the outer elements in the surrounding universe that is important and actually, as we see in the theory of this practice, is relevant to the efficacy of contemplative practice. It's actually relevant to how we do meditation and how we ultimately aspire to overcome suffering in cyclic existence, right? It's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. But you do have, as you say, they have the disposition of the person and the corresponding element. I guess the key then is exposure to the elements. You mentioned listening to water. Is it that you listen to space, you listen to floating air, you listen to no sound? How is this implied? What's the implication
Mhm.
then?
Yeah, there isn't a listening to space practice. I've not come across a listening to space practice, but I do like that idea. Um, I like that idea very much. I haven't seen it in the text. There are practices for listening to earth, water, fire, and wind.
Mm-hmm.
So in when they say listening, they also mean something beyond listening in the strict sense. For example, when you when you do the practices of listening to earth, it's a very tactile practice, actually. It involves like actually working with clay. So there's this kind of kinesthetic practice. And there is
Mm-hmm.
certainly hearing involved, but it's could more accurately, I think for expedience's sake, we say listening or they say listening, right? But in fact, the practice involves kind of engaging the whole sensorium
Yeah.
relative to this element of earth, right? So kind of making pebbles of clay, holding them in your hand, feeling and hearing the way that they interact with each other. This is the practice of listening to earth. Listening to water also, I mean, water has a really distinctive sound, especially if you go to a place like a waterfall
That
or
kind of
like
completely takes over all your other senses.
exactly.
I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
I've been cycling along the river, along the rapids. It rushes really through. This is what
I
you
don't know
call
if there's an English
water?
word. Is there a German word for it?
Ja, Stromschnelle.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love that. Actually, I love that word because like there's in the texts they use a lot of onomatopoetic words to
Hmm.
describe the sounds, right? And
Yeah.
so David Germano and I, my who was my dissertation advisor and now is a friend and collaborator, and we've been retranslating some of these materials that we translated together previously, and we keep trying to find the right onomatopoetic words for the
Yeah.
rushing, whooshing sound of water that
Ah,
they
yeah, yeah.
keep referring to. And they use like words that have the sh kind of sibilant
I know
sound.
the
Yeah.
Tibetan language does have words that kind of, but what I
Anyway,
wanted to say is like it completely takes over all the other sensory perceptions, kind of, if you rest a little bit, you don't really feel the wind anymore, or you don't.
Hmm.
relate to the other perceptions as much because it's so overwhelming.
Yeah, and what it feels like in a body. I mean, and this gets into another kind of pet interest of mine, which is this kind of burgeoning uh field of microphenomenology, uh, which we can talk about if that's interesting. But yeah, when you actually put yourself in front of like the quickening of the river or a waterfall, you experience it not just as sound, but as like a fully felt, embodied experience, right? There's like this quality of the water. There's actually like almost this kind of electric feeling sometimes people feel because of the negative ions that are created from the water, like crashing into itself. It actually creates like an abundance of negative ions. And so you almost can feel like a certain kind of charge in these places.
Yeah,
Do you know
it
what I'm talking
certainly
about?
pulls you, draws you in.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
it's
as
felt.
yeah,
It's
and as I think many of the contemplative practices of the Dzogchen traditions are to like take you off of the thinking mind, like
yeah.
create
It's
a certain, you might say, a shock or a certain level of involvement that enables the practitioner to like be out of the regular mind of thoughts, other than just like calming thoughts, other than
yeah.
just trying to work with thoughts. So this, I could imagine that this is what is supposed to happen there.
Well, and yeah, what you're saying is exactly right. The way you said it is exactly right. There's like something effortless about it. It doesn't take additional energy or work to just allow yourself to be absorbed in the experience of being present with the water, right? And that connects to, you could say like the kind of general foundational thesis of the Dzogchen tradition, right? Which is this kind of critique of effort.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think it goes along with the great deal of simplicity at the same time,
mhm.
because
Yeah, exactly.
it's not creating an environment like that is extreme and placing oneself into this extreme environment in order to be overwhelmed,
Yeah.
but exposing oneself to a natural phenomenon that is there
Mhm.
to like just be taken over, but not taken over in an abusive or violent way,
Mhm.
I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's simple. It's not elaborate, and it is so natural to like who we are as human beings and our kind of aesthetic proclivities, right? We're drawn to these. There's this idea of like the biophilia hypothesis, that human beings are kind of naturally drawn to organic shapes and colors and natural phenomena. There's something just like that we feel that's just immediately salubrious. It's uplifting. It draws us towards it. And I think that is an important piece of the practice and raises questions about whose agency is
Mm.
really activated, right? Do the elements call us to them, right? Or do we direct our attention to the elements? Is a question that I like to think about a lot as well.
Yeah. I mean, it might also be the Western perception of this like strong separation of
Hmm.
like outside,
Hmm.
inside me and the surrounding. And like I could see this very, very well going in the same direction as the mandala practices, where you have the central divinity that is the Buddha nature and the unraveling of the surroundings as the palace of the deity or so, which also I feel in the sense of the Buddhist concept of liberation from duality leads or has the same thing, like not to insist on this differentiation between the person and the surrounding, but that there is not a complete difference between those.
Yeah, and I think that that is present even in the very theory of how matter works in these examples, because again, the practitioner is directed to connect the elements of their body with the elements in the surrounding environment. So it's almost like, this distinction between self and other becomes less important. And what becomes more important is this relationship between the the inner bodily elements and the outer bodily elements, right? Their
Mhm.
connection to each other is actually what's, perhaps you could say, producing part of what's producing the religious experience.
I think also in generally in old Tibet, on one side, nature and thus the elements were in abundance. There was no shortage of it. And as far as I can see from the little I have seen from my Tibetan friends, and so perception of the surrounding can be very different also in different cultural settings already. The perception of one's place in those surroundings can be entirely different than what we as Western people generally assume, you can say
Yeah,
naturally.
absolutely. I mean, I have many thoughts about that. I think the first thing that comes to mind is just the specificity of land and the interconnection, what land is and what land represents to for example, indigenous people um, for whom that land is like the ancestral land in which their traditions and their ancestors and their histories have taken place, right? It's a different thing, and it's like land and the connections there can be ontologically generative for certain kinds of people and certain kinds of bodies, but not necessarily everyone, right? So there's like concerns that I have about the idea of kind of practicing with practices that are created within the domain of a specific kind of set of relationships with land, and then trying to sort of extract or appropriate that and apply it to different kinds of.
I think that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Because in the wave of translating Buddhism, like translating practical Buddhism, apart from translating text where you just have a set of guidelines or whatever, and you translate the words and the meaning. But as Buddhism translates to the West, I
Mm.
think that's a big thing when the Tibetan Buddhism I know has many perceptions of the surroundings that are not part of like my European setting. And
Mhm.
I wonder if the skandhas of the people here would ever be in relation to those elements, and if these elements or these also non-human forms would actually be present in their surrounding.
Yeah, it's also an especially tricky thing. I mean, you're European in Europe, I'm a white settler in indigenous territories in the Americas. So the question becomes even more complicated when you think about these different kinds of intersections, the way the different kinds of identities intersect with land and histories of colonialism and objectification and extraction and all of these things. And I think a lot about this, and I think you can't really. I think it would be irresponsible to not think about it as a Buddhist and as a Buddhist practitioner and as someone who, is trying to relate with environmental ethics and so on. That being said, there is a crucial need, I think, for people, let's say in the global north, in people who are colonizers, who are settlers, or who are existing within like colonized and settled places, even if they are like sort of disruptors of normative, colonialism in their sort of everyday activities. There is a need to be related. I think there is a need, or there is a call, or there is something important about connecting with the elements wherever we are. The elements might not be the same elements. They may not even be the same elements that they were, let's say, in the Holocene. Like the Anthropocene elements might be something entirely different.
Yeah. Could one also approach this from seeing this as different layers?
Mm,
I imagine there's a fundamental layer of elements and
mm,
communication of the person's physical setup with the outer elements. And then there is the actual environment that is also having a cultural expression that has thought, that
mm,
has traditions, and so on.
mhm,
So if you have a waterfall, it's nobody's waterfall. But if you have a waterfall at a sacred place and so on, and you would have like the talk of a native divinity, it might not be your divinity. and
Yeah.
might not communicate even with you
Hmm.
as if I would go like to Asia or to Africa, for example, I would most likely not feel this
Hmm.
energy that people are feeling.
Yeah.
I would be bereft of the story.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right. It's like the question is like if one were to train in the technique,
yeah,
would these cosmic beings still speak to
yeah. I mean,
everyone?
it's like
Yeah.
that's the question. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, I think there's an archetypical layer of this where such practices might still be translatable.
I agree. I mean, I think there's something really important about, and there's a lot of, certainly I'm not the only one saying this. There's a kind of history of, especially like, well, certainly indigenous scholars, but ecofeminist also scholars, for example, and feminist scholars in general talking about this kind of experiential turn. Um, I think this turn to experience, this turn to practice is much wider than just for those of us in Buddhist studies or for those of us who do Buddhist meditation. And there is something really important about practices that enable us to experience what we think of as like the environment, or let's say it becomes political and the stakes become higher when you say climate or climate change, right? But experiencing this level of things that we interpret as outer as actually like happening
Hmm.
within and through us, right? And I think that's something that can be achieved through contemplative practice. And I think it's important, actually. I think it's an important layer. It's not the only thing, but
No, no, but there are
yeah.
different aspects I think that can coexist. Yeah, this is very, very interesting.
Well, it's
I'm
so cool. Thanks for inviting me.
very happy that you have joined me for this.